Let's talk about GPU rendering on the cluster. So far, I only showed you the demos where I was doing CPU-based rendering. So for a small dataset, we used a single core on Cedar. For a large dataset, we use 120 cores on Cedar. But you can also use GPU cards on our cluster for rendering. To render on a GPU from ParaView, traditionally you would require OpenGL support in the GPU driver and also an X server, so basically a windowing system that is running on the compute node that is hosting the GPU card. And then the X server will let you open Windows, and then you will render into this Windows from a GPU. However, for the past few years, NVIDIA drivers naturally have a special layer called EGL, stands for Embedded System Graphics Library, that let you create an OpenGL rendering context without requiring the live windowing system, so without requiring the X11 server. And we have a special version of ParaView called ParaView Offscreen GPU 5.4.0 module that was actually compiled to be used without a windowing system on the cluster. And it works really, really well. So the only thing is when you use this module, you start a ParaView 5.4.0 server on the cluster, and you have to use the same 5.4 ParaView version on the client when you establish the client-server communication. So this slide and the next slide shows you in detail the steps that you need to follow if you want to do visualization in the cluster. Essentially, it's very similar to what I showed you with the CPU-based rendering demos before. You will start an interactive job. And inside the interactive job, you will need to specify that you need a GPU cluster. So in this case, we're starting a serial interactive job. So just one MPI task. And then we're asking for one GPU. So that's a number of GPUs per node. But since we're using a single node, by just asking for a single GPU. So asking for 30 minutes maximum runtime. And then in this case, I'm asking for 4,000 megabytes of memory. So it's an interactive job. And once it's started, you'll need to load the ParaView Offscreen GPU module. You probably want to unset your display variable. You'll start the ParaView service. In this case, because we're running on a single processor, we're just starting the serial ParaView server. And eventually, once the service starts running, it will say that accepting connection on a given port on this compute node on Cedar. And then on your desktop in a different terminal, you will need to establish SSH port forwarding to the same node on Cedar, where you have a ParaView server waiting for incoming connection. And then you connect to the local host inside ParaView GUI. So you need to be using ParaView 5.4 on your computer. You connect to a local host, port 1111, and then click connect. And this will establish the client-server communication. And then when you actually do rendering, this rendering will be done interactively on the GPU on the cluster. So you have to be aware of a couple of issues. So one is sometimes GPUs in the cluster can get stuck in a strange mode. And you will get an error, only EGL 1.4 and greater allows OpenGL as a client API. And in these cases, if you see this problem, let us know. I unfortunately don't know what causes this problem, so it's a bug in the NVIDIA GPU driver, as far as I know. And the only solution that I found is the entire node needs to be restarted. And this is unfortunate because a node can be shared by many users, and if we have to restart a node, then we'll have to kill somebody else's jobs. So this is not something we really want to do. And this is also one of the reasons why I discourage people from doing GPU rendering, and instead I recommend doing CPU rendering on the cluster. If things go well, then once you establish the client-server communication, in ParaView preferences, you can go in the menu in render view, and then set this value of remote render threshold to some non-zero value. So the idea is that beyond this value in megabytes, all rendering will be remote. So the default value is 20 megabytes. So that means that anything larger than 20 megabytes is going to be processed on the cluster. Anything smaller than 20 megabytes will be done locally. So if you set this value to something small, for example, 0 megabytes, then all rendering will be done on the cluster. So that's great because your laptop will not be taxed. On the other hand, if you try to do rendering interactively with this value, everything will be done remotely. So even if you try to do, rotation of a data set or anything very small, then everything will be done on the cluster. And then it will take time for this new image to be actually rendered on your laptop, right? So this might introduce some delay. So play with these values and find the optimum value that works for you. So obviously you don't want to set this value to too high, because otherwise all rendering will be done on your laptop, and that's just counterproductive because you do want to use the cluster's GPU.